Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to sort of set our sights a little bit longer term this evening. I've got Richard Lyall, who is the president of ResCon, the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, with me tonight. And he's mentioned a couple of things that are kind of interesting. He said that we've got a housing crisis, yes, but more importantly, we've got a growth management issue and crisis, and that we don't have a vision that's thinking long term enough as to the kind of cities and country that we're going to be living in. And so I thought that, given that we're sort of going back to school and lots of people are, have been away for the summer and are coming back to the work, and we're sort of, some people think about September and Labor Day as the start of the year. It may not be the start of the calendar year, but start of the work year, and we're all back full time. I thought it'd be good to sort of chat with Richard about his concerns and also about his statement that we lack long-term vision. Richard, welcome to the show, sir.
Good morning. Pleased to be here.
So tell me, what's your concern? You said to start with that we got a housing crisis, yes, but more importantly, we've got a growth management crisis. What did you mean by that?
Well, when I think about for example, the development of Canada and its growth and history of that, and some of the extraordinary things that were accomplished in the formation of this country, not the least of which, of course, were the National Railway across Canada, which was an incredible feat for its time in terms of infrastructure, vision, determination. And it was huge. I mean, Canada was a relatively imagine building a railway across Canada today. You'd probably never get it done. And, but they did it. And it was all in aid of building something better, because most Canadians, of course, that came here, especially, a lot of the early European settlers, people talk about privilege and things like this and so on, but, really where they were leaving some pretty horrible situations to come here, and were driven and desired a better future. And so we had these projects, we had this effort to build something better, and I think we've kind of lost the plot. I'm not feeling it today. I don't see what I see. For example, I mean, it still does exist in other jurisdictions in the world, but I'm not seeing it here to the same extent. And there's a lack of coordination. There's a lot of, to my mind, short-termism that seems to be ruling the day. Politically, a lot is all about what do the polls show, and are we going to win the next election, more than something bigger than that. Yeah, sure, there's some infrastructure projects, the Ontario line, say, for example, and things like that, but that's not nation building. And then when I think about housing, how on earth did we get this wrong? And so badly too, as well, that we're in a situation now where younger Canadians and younger families are facing a much worse situation than their parents ever did. And certainly it's completely contrary to, I think what a lot of us were taught, certainly maybe in my generation, was that, it was drilled into me and others I know, that you leave the world a better place when we're not doing that. It's better in many areas, but but housing is, for example, one of those fundamental areas. And that's not happening for a huge proportion of the population. And when you think about, and it's not that they necessarily can't get housing, but they can't build much beyond that. Back in the day, you could go to school, get an education, start a job, get a place to live, save some money, and maybe start a business or do something like that. I mean, that's just a dream. It's not even a dream. It's not real for many young people, and many of them are leaving too as well. So
I was at a wedding recently with a bunch of people in their late 20s, early 30s, and we were just sitting around after the wedding, after a few drinks and chatting, and there was visceral anger about disappointment, about how it would take a lot longer for them to save up money for a down payment. And if they ever got an opportunity to buy something, and if they got an opportunity to buy something, it was probably a 1 or 2 bedroom condominium if they were lucky. And it certainly wasn't a single family home with a pool and a backyard. And that if that was a dream, they'd be moving to Calgary or out of the Greater Toronto area for sure to afford it. And it was this sense that my generation had messed up. We are the first generation, I think, in history to leave a worse economic future for our kids than any other generation in the past. And you talked about housing, and I think housing and affordability is number one issue. But you got to add to that, debt that is at a extreme, deficits that are at extreme, a situation where our pensions may be pre-funded, but our health care is not, our long-term care is not. We're going to have far fewer people working for the number of people that are over the age of 65 or 75 than it's ever existed in the future. On top of that, you've got climate change and then people saying AI is going to take away all those jobs. So it's a pretty daunting future that we have created for our kids, isn't it?
It is, and it's. I mean, you know what? While you're saying that, and very good points, I was thinking there's been some very good things that have happened too, but they're getting outweighed by some of these bigger ones. But it's an environment of fear now, like that Jetsons that feeling of hope that you can conquer anything. That really prevailed, if you think about it, after World War II historically. It was now the Allies won, and they won by virtue of better technology and better supplies and I think a better cause, right? We were fighting fascism and stuff like that. I had family in that fight, and the one before that, the big one before that. So there was this wonderful feeling of hope and that you could conquer all. You had the moonshot, right? We're going to go to the moon in 10 years, and they did it. And that was really a Canada and United States effort, but Canada was involved in that because, of course, places like Ontario are closer to Michigan and Illinois and New York State than Texas is. I mean, we're really part of an integrated economic unit. So, but there was this wonderful sort of, I mean, and that wasn't to say that there weren't problems. You had Kennedy and Luther King shot in 1968. I mean, there were hard times there, and you had the Nixon event, but there was this sort of prevailing in the positive feeling and a sense of direction, and I think that still does exist, certainly in other parts of North America, but we just seem to have lost it, and everything's sort of there's not much on a positive level that's happening, but I just don't see that vision about, okay, how are we going to be living? What's it going to look like in a generation? There's no sense of that. And I think while we talk about, so for example, to bring it back to housing, when we talk about the housing targets and the plan to get there, well, there isn't one. They're not running any kind of modeling or simulations or saying, okay, if we do this, what effect will that have on supply? I mean, heck, they don't even know the data. That we don't have the information. They don't know systemically what is actually being produced right now. And I think in some respects, I think that's part of the little surprise announcement where there was a little higher uptick in starts than the economists were expecting that was announced a couple of days ago. I wasn't surprised by that because they just first and foremost, they just don't really, again, know what's happening. Of course, you can't solve a problem unless you understand the problem. You can't understand a problem unless you have the information, and that comes down to data. And all three levels of government have been talking about that. But we have really bad data, amongst other things. So, Canada's a difficult country to manage too, because it's the most decentralized country in the developed world. So we've got
the most decentralized country.
Yeah.
You really think that?
Yeah, no, it's a fact. The only thing, in fact, I did back in my academic period of life, the only country that's really close to it is Belgium, but it's really just divided into two. You've got the Flemish and the Walloon side of things, and then Germany. The state governments in Germany are actually quite powerful and independent. Canada, provinces are very powerful. They have health, education, welfare. The big ticket items outside of defense. And although we know that story in Canada, so we really haven't been putting too much into that. But yeah, it's decentralized. So, that's where I think part of the problem is, like, right now, if you take Toronto, mix it into the equation, you got three levels of government with three different political parties that don't play well together. And yes, they align on certain specific projects where it suits their separate purposes, but there really isn't an overall plan. And of course, we're seeing that in housing, and we're seeing that in housing and immigration and things like that. But I think that absence of a plan is really the product of an absence of a sort of a vision. And as you pointed out, Brian, the outlook is quite negative. I talk to young people, and what they're talking about, most of them, is leaving. And I know this, anecdotally and otherwise. But anecdotally, I've got four kids between the ages of 17 and 25, and they're not, well, I mean, I can help them, but over 2/3 of young people don't have that benefit, and even my capacity to help them is, they've got to work too. But at least there's that. But their friends, the ones that don't have, sort of rich parents, put it that way, they're getting out of Dodge. That's what they want to do, and you can't blame them. And then when we look at other things that have changed too, I think it's having an effect on the birth rate. I don't think the birth rate is just a housing story. I think it's more of a story about just this absence of vision. And then, of course, many of the wonderful things that got us to where we are today, have been trashed. Some with maybe some justification, but because evolution in history over time is not necessarily a pleasant or a comfortable process, and winners take all and all that stuff. But we just don't seem to have, again, that, because historically, and I think your history, if you look back into what life was like for the average Canadian in the 19th century, even well into the 20th century, the slums that existed before the building of Toronto City Hall, people forget their history. I mean, it was a hard life. It was brutal. But there was this drive to create something better.
And
Again,
are you saying that we no
yeah.
longer have that drive? We no longer have that desire to create something better?
I'm not as a blanket statement. I don't want to say that. And there are individual areas where there's wonderful, wonderful things happening. But I'm just thinking systemically, this is at a governmental level, we've kind of lost our way. Like, even there was a great piece in the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an essay published earlier this year called "The Crisis in Canadian Governance," and it went through a number of examples where sort of major public policy programs were basically failed miserably. One was, of course, the ArriveCan app problem and what happened there and how that was managed. But there are other situations where, I mean, take your pick: eHealth, Presto cards, some of the,
I agree
that
with
they're
you,
just
Richard,
not.
in that regard, but that's not necessarily long-term vision. That's just block and tackle, day-to-day operational implementation. And I've interviewed other people that say the problem we've got is we've got too many big thinkers and not enough of the thinkers that are the doers that get things done. That we need more chief. I had one guy who
You're
former
right.
chief of staff to Brian Mulroney and several premiers, who said we need chief operating officers in each one of our major ministries because it's getting stuff done that's the biggest challenge, not thinking about the stuff we'd like to do.
Well, that's exactly the point. Sorry. our conversation hadn't evolved to that point, but I'm glad because that's vitally important to this conversation. We have technocratic challenges, but we don't have technocrats dealing with them. And you need to. I've been in meetings on the digitization and the modernization of things, and have realized that I'm talking to people that don't really have a clue what we're really talking about. In terms of whether it's digital twinning or AI applications, building information modeling, using the GIS systems, and basically catching up with more advanced jurisdictions. We somehow still operate under that. Remember the old British, anyone with a good public school education, aka, in Britain that was private school, can basically run anything. Well, no, not any longer. Some of the things that we're running now are very complex. So the crisis in Canadian governance is our inability systemically to, by and large, manage larger complex projects, infrastructure projects, and the interconnection between some of these projects. And that comes down to the lack of expertise on some of these things. Because if you look at some of these individual cases, and that McDonald Laurier Institute had I think 4 examples in there. I mean, they just come down to some pretty basic mistakes being made overall, and then like, for example, look at in the time it took Ottawa to completely mess up a single LRT line, which start to finish, from vision to where we are now, is basically almost a generation. The city of Shanghai built 16 subway lines and 480 stations. Now that's China, but they have managed on things like that. They're very good at. You look at the greater Tokyo area, and no one really likes to talk about Tokyo in terms of housing. And I think there's a reason for that, is because it begs the question, well, why can't we do what they've done, right? And they are at the cutting edge of new AI, smart city growth. Fujisawa, which is near Mount Fuji, is a new modern master plan smart city that's being built. We're going over to have a look at it this fall. But when you look at a city with the population of Canada that works so smoothly, that has better housing than we have, better transit, and less expensive housing by a wide margin, and it's a growing area. I mean, the overall population of Japan is falling, but this part of Japan is still growing, and what they have achieved and what they continue to achieve. It just doesn't seem like we're matching that. And I think that, when you think about sidewalk, when it came to Toronto, and we were going to have that smart city thing down on the waterfront there, I think one of the reasons why that failed was because, of course, they were overconfident, sheer hubris. They thought they were, the cat's meow. Meanwhile, on our side, I don't think we had people that really understood what that was. And then they got sidetracked on some of these silly data debates and information and privacy and stuff like that. And a huge opportunity was lost there.
I think it's a massive opportunity that was lost
Yeah.
there. Richard, we got to take a break for some messages.
Okay.
We're going to be back with Richard Lyall talking about really the future, and do we have vision in the Greater Toronto Area and Ontario and Canada for the type of Canada that we need to have in the future? And are we too short-term oriented? Do we have the operational expertise, the technocratic expertise? And I think most importantly, with Richard's comments, do we have that long-term vision about the country we want to have in the future? Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Richard Lyall. He is the president of ResCon, the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. Richard, you've got a really interesting background. You've got an undergraduate degree in political science, it would appear, and then a master's in political science, and the master's was actually in administrative theory and economic development. What the heck is administrative theory?
Well, so I studied under one of the Canadian greats in this area, Carolyn Toohey at the University of Toronto, and it was a toss up whether I was going to do a PhD. My undergraduate degree was actually I did it's now called the Monk School. It was the specialist program in international relations at U of T, and I did a major in economic history. And then my graduate, when I did my master's, that was basically all about the management of economic development. It had a kind of a third world perspective. That was sort of the flavor of the day, but it was administrative theory, institutional design, policy, program development, and policy. And it was basically about, okay, how do you manage growth? And then I did work for the government. I worked in industry policy, technology policy. I worked in trade policy.
For 7 years, you were a senior policy
Yeah,
analyst with the Ministry of Economic Development.
that's right. That's right. And then I left government to do what I'm doing now, basically. So it's
You spent
but
32 years with the Metropolitan Toronto Apartment Builders Association as the president.
yep. I started with that, and then we created ResCon along the way. The MTABA still exists. And then we created some other groups, and ResCon is really an umbrella group of other organizations, and we also along the way created the Ontario Skilled Trades Alliance, helped set that up, the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance on infrastructure, the Ontario Construction and Design, that's a grouping with the architects and engineers and various groups, and then on employee benefits, did a lot of work there over the years with the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans, and all really sort of focused on what's coming down the pipe, what do we need to do to address things, and how do we create better opportunities. Been dealing with housing change, housing design change, the evolution of the building code, and the greening of building and stuff like that. So
So
yeah,
let's
it's pretty much all about change.
So you've worked in government, you've studied
Yeah.
economic development and growth. You've worked in associations both from an apartment standpoint and residential construction standpoint. I understand that some of that time has been closely associated with some union organizations, and so you understand
Yep.
laborers. Clearly, you understand developers and their need to develop. So you understand government, you understand unions, you understand builders and developers. As you've looked
Yeah.
at the housing
Yep.
crisis, and
Yes.
CMHC saying that we need 1.8 million more homes in Southern Ontario, 3.5 million homes in Canada. The provincial government saying we need 1.5 million homes. I think most people thinking that we've got a supply issue, at least in Southern Ontario or the Greater Toronto area, if not, frankly, in other places across Canada, Vancouver, Montreal as well. What's your assessment as to what needs to get done? What do we need to do? What are the challenges that are stopping us from building enough homes?
Well, I'm glad you pointed out there are different stories across Canada, but still, by and large, for example, even though Calgary's got a housing boom going on right now, it has its own challenges, and they're creeping up on them rapidly. Montreal's different, Vancouver's different, but overall, we have one of the worst housing crises in the developed world, and Ontario's probably the worst in Canada outside of the Lower Mainland of BC in terms of the supply challenge. And we had this stunning disconnect between immigration policy and housing policy and healthcare policy. So hence we're seeing the results of that now, where we had far more people here than they knew. Remember that data problem we talked about? Then they went off on this crazy foreign student bonanza, if you want to call it that, without regard to certain factors there. And then they doubled immigration without considering or fully considering those other two factors, and without really acknowledging that there were more people here than they knew. Some of them knew. I mean, I've always said there's way more people here than the government wants to admit, and it's, and here we are, right? So we had this sort of um, this planning problem where, of course, we lack the housing, right? Minor detail, and housing is so critical to well-being, which isn't measured. We typically run around measuring things on a per capita GDP basis, which is a very brutal, rough tool to try. It doesn't capture how well people are living. Um, so here we are, and where are we going? Where are we going with this? And this is where, you mentioned a number of different target numbers there, right? 1.5, 4.8, 3.5. Well, we don't even have an agreed upon, like, let's pick a target and then let's manage this and say, okay, and break it down and say, okay, then what does this mean every year? How many units where? We've done that to a bit, but then what kind of units? We obviously, a lot of the housing that we're producing now is much smaller than the housing we were producing a generation ago. 350 square foot studio apartment is not a single family home, but in terms of units of housing, it's counted as the same thing. And we know that story. I mean, like, you take the GTA, 20 years ago, I remember we were dealing with we had a framing crisis. We didn't have enough carpenters. We were framing 35,000 units of housing a year. This year, it'll be lucky if we have 8,000 units on the low rise. These are low rise homes, and so while we were producing, say, on average, let's call it 240, 220,000 units of housing a year across Canada, the units have been getting smaller, and they're not, really suitable for family formation. Now you think, well, okay, there's going to be a transfer, maybe the baby boomers moving out, and I think some people were counting on that. But of course, people are living longer now, which is a good thing. I'm not gonna argue with that. And the other thing that happened is that people that are, we talk about empty bedrooms. Well, yeah, we've got a lot of empty bedrooms, but that's only because boomers that might otherwise want to sell and move into some sort of a nice mid-rise scaled neighborhood, something like that, that they actually don't have anywhere to go, right? So we've got some going to Florida and Arizona and things like that, the ones that have some money, but the ones that don't want to leave for any number of reasons are staying in place. They're staying in their homes, so they're not getting sort of occupied by the next generation, as it were. So it's an
Well, and then
inefficient kind of,
we
yeah.
level a land transfer tax, both provincially as well as municipally on top of them.
Well, yeah. And so on that note, you had asked, what do we need to do? Well, one of the things that, and we did the study on this, not government. We paid for it. We did the study based on the question. I asked the question, how much money on new housing, how much money is going into taxes, fees, and levies? And we did the study on it. In Ontario, it was 31%. BC separately later did their own study. I think it was their Board of Trade out there or whatever, and they were at 30%. Compared to other major cities, like you take Toronto and Vancouver out of the equation, it's a totally different story. You think about the city of Vaughan in Ontario, single-family home development charges 145,000. The city of London, Ontario, 45,000. City of Calgary, 22,000. How do you explain that differential? And the fact that these development charges are the most regressive and inequitable tax ever created in Canadian history. It's not growth pays for growth. It's called new home buyers and renters pay for all the infrastructure, which is economically wrong. And I know that from, as you mentioned, my development studies and stuff like that. So we've got that one tax. Then you got the HST. The HST, when it was brought in on housing, was supposed to have been adjusted for inflation. Never happened. The federal government for the last decade has been making out like bandits. They're actually the biggest profiteer in housing. They get about 40% of all the housing taxes and only invest about 7% in the real estate. That's sort of the infrastructure that spending that's been happening. So you have that problem. And then, as you pointed out, Brian, you got these land transfer taxes that came up. And then the taxes, fees, and levies on various permits and things like that have all gone through the roof. DC's alone, one calculation I saw in the last decade, increased 900%.
What?
Take this
900%?
900%. Like, for example, about 12 years ago, DC on a two-bedroom condo in Toronto was about $8,000, and now it's $100,000. I think it's actually over 900%. It's the numbers are crazy, but it's been an insidious sort of death by a thousand cuts. And so I was talking to a builder from Dallas down at the International Builder Show not a few months ago. And I said, what are your taxes, fees, and levies in Dallas? He said, what do you mean? I said, the impact fees. Yeah, I know you get impact fees, right? When you're building new buildings, like, what are you paying? He thought about it for a while. And he went, I'm 1%. I said, come on. I told him it was 31% where we are. And he looked at me like I was completely mad. And then I said, so you got to be higher than 1%, buddy. I mean, he said, okay, how about, it was a very Texas response. He said, because it was the same answer, right? He said, okay, it's under 2. I love that stuff. But, now they're at one end of the extreme, but you take Austin, Texas, a young STEM star from Canada moves to Austin, Texas. They pay half the income tax. They get 3 times the housing for the money. And Texas is one of the top cities, smart cities of the future, and a pretty nice place to live by all accounts, right?
And no state income tax.
No state income tax. That's right. And they're getting paid the same dollar amount, except their currency is worth a little more than ours.
So are you worried about brain drain?
Oh, absolutely. That is happening. There's no doubt about that. No doubt about that. Because you know what we did? Between these taxes and then, capital gains tax, that's another story that changed there, which made no sense at all. It was idiotic. I mean, to be blunt. But yeah, I mean, the tax incentive, we kicked the dog. I mean, people are aware. There's much greater awareness of other opportunities and mobility. COVID really did a number on mobility. You don't have to be here. You don't have to, and under NAFTA too, you don't have to start your company here. Yeah, you can live in Toronto. You can have a family here, but you can start the company south of the border, right? And so, we've and by the way, I think some of these factors are coming to bear. You think about the city of Mississauga, population falling. City of Toronto, population numbers are actually coming down. What? What is that?
Out migration.
Out migration. And we're not, and remember, we talked about data and the lack of data and lagging data. Systemically, we don't really know what's going on. And I think there'll be some surprises there for people. And then the consequences of that too. Watch what happens to, because we know starts are falling dramatically. Housing, new projects are they're going to be falling. I mean, we're building out what we're building out.
I've heard that in condos. Is that happening in other sectors other than just condos?
Yeah. The ICI is slowing down. Civil is largely government money that's driving that. On housing, there was the uptick in starts and an uptick in Ontario, but we're talking about stuff that was already sold. Because remember, it takes so long between the time you sell a condo and you actually build it, you actually start construction, can be 2, 3, 4 years, right? So that's when we did have a big sales boom in condos not long ago. So we're building that out. But in terms of the new project pipeline, you can call planning departments and whatever. We've got a lot of projects that were approved, but they're not going ahead for economic reasons now. and the stuff that was sold is getting built, but there's no new projects coming down the pipeline. You talk to our construction sub-trades, and they're afraid, and as they should be. And we're starting to laugh people. And tower cranes, as they come down, going forward, won't be coming back up again. So
Where do they go?
well, they're starting to get stored north of Toronto. I know there's one area where there's a field up there where there's a bunch of tower cranes that are, or they'll go to other jurisdictions. You know, the U.S. housing market is starting to rebound now. And their rents are very stable, unlike our rent situation in many areas. Although now in Toronto, rents are coming down, condo rents are coming down. But I think that's a reflection of what's happening in the economy that's not being measured properly going forward. So
So
we've
we've
got
got
some.
a housing crisis of inaffordability and lack of supply, but at the same time, you're saying that starts are going down because of the current economic situation. Cranes are being dismantled and being stored in fields or going to other jurisdictions. There's layoffs of construction workers. It seems like we got a problem and it's getting worse.
Well, this is the thing. I've talked to many people about this, and I'm engaged in various groups. I'm on the provincial implementation team on the housing crisis, and we had a further consultation on amendments to the Planning Act that remain needed. Yeah, it's we're not going in the right direction. Right now, I mean, there was that little uptick in starts in the last month, which is good, but overall, yeah, starts have been coming down, certainly in the low-rise area, which is the first part of the industry to be affected, and they will be coming down. The actual construction activity will be coming down in the high-rise as projects are completed and there's nothing there to replace them. And it's a huge concern because we know what the targets are. Like, I talked about different targets, and maybe we should have just one target. But, the fact is that all of them are big targets, and we're in no danger of,
Getting close to
basically
meeting
what's
them.
been. No, what we've actually achieved so far is to keep producing what we were producing at those levels before. But we're in no danger of increasing or doubling anything at this stage.
I'm told that
And the
we
thing,
are building
yeah,
the same number of units today that we did in 1970.
that's
And the
right.
population has doubled.
That's right. That's right. And
Crazy,
and and
absolutely
by the
crazy.
way, and we had a labor supply shortage then too. We were taking people off boats and trains on the day they were arriving, construction laborers. But guess what? And yeah, I know you know this, Brian. Within 3-4 years, those same people were buying a home and raising a family as a construction worker. They can't do that now.
You certainly can.
The income in Toronto you need to own a home is $235,000. It's insane. The new client for Habitat for Humanity, guess which group that's from? The middle class. Who would ever have thought that was even possible?
Moving
But
into a
that's
Habitat for Humanity home. Richard, we got to take
yeah.
a break for some messages. We're going to become
Okay.
back with Richard in just 2 minutes, talking about lack of vision and where's this country going. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes.
All right.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Richard Lyall, the president of ResCon, the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. But we're talking about a lot of things. We've been talking about the housing crisis, lack of housing supply. We've been talking about taxes. He says that 31% of new home construction in Ontario right now goes to taxes. He says the HST and the federal government take is the biggest at 40%, and they only spend about 8% on infrastructure. He's described development fees in Vaughan and Toronto that are over 100,000, and yet elsewhere across the country would be 20 to 40,000. And so therefore there's this, what he describes as the most regressive, inequitable tax that we've ever created, the development charges. And on top of all that, Richard, StatsCan and CMHC did a study that said that our red tape and regulation and the time to get approval for housing is the longest in the Western world, and that Toronto and Vancouver are the worst in what's a bad country. So I got to ask you, given what we've talked about, and you talked about ArriveCan and eHealth and stuff like that. I could talk about an LRT in Ottawa that you mentioned being over budget and late, but also about the Eglinton Crosstown, about the Huron-Ontario LRT, go on and on. The Trans Mountain Pipeline that is over budget by billions of dollars. We don't seem to be able to do housing, infrastructure. Our taxation levels are high. Our red tape and regulation is extreme. You've talked about a lack of vision and short-termism. What is the solution?
What's the solution? So we got to do a better job. And the funny thing is we've got the best people in the world. And I don't want to sound like Doug Ford, but it's true. We do have. Well, I don't mind sounding like the premier. He's a good guy. But we do have phenomenal people here. We have builders. So for example, saying, well, builders got to improve their productivity. They're not productive enough. And this is, whatever. And I say, hey, a lot of our big members are building very successfully in the United States. It's not some kind of inability to build efficiently. We're competing with the best in the world. And we can build anything in the world. It's just how we are managing some of these things. And it comes down to that. Funnily enough, I got into trouble when I was studying economic development decades ago when there was a very strong left perspective on things. And I was saying, one of the problems with third world development is just mismanagement. It's not colonialism. Cut all that baloney out. It's mismanagement. It's projects being taken over and put in the hands of people that are not qualified to run them. How many times have we seen that here? And I could name a few names recently of people that were recently appointed to positions that they're not qualified for. And they're not going to make a difference. And we're not going to get it right. And we can't afford this anymore. Brian, when you think about it, I always think about the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and it brings a tear to my eye about, well, why, Norway, with its population of 6 million people, has a $1.7 trillion sovereign wealth fund. Where's Canada's? We're the richest country on the planet. And we don't have that. We've got high government debt levels, massive waste. I've often said, please tell me on this most recent mess up of a project, tell me somebody sitting on a yacht somewhere who's benefited from this and that it just wasn't stupidity. Please, I'd like to know that there's some corruption. Maybe somebody was clever somewhere, but no, it's just that we're not getting it. We're not getting certain critical things right. And that's because there's a lack of alignment. It's bad management. There's the authority is too diffuse. The accountability is not there, both within certain silos within the government system, and then overall. When was the last time you heard of a senior manager, and I'll use management, the person in charge, getting sacked because one of these major projects was, a complete and utter failure? Like, for example, ArriveCan. I think I heard that a couple were suspended, a pending investigation. That's going to take how long, right? Whatever. But there is this lack of consequence for failure. And there's a lack of transparency, and of course there's accountability, and that's what you get through modernizing things. I mean, we've got technicians in Toronto, in the greater Toronto area, whose specialty are fixing old facsimile machines that are still being used by doctors' offices, if you can believe it. It's true. And because they don't make them anymore, but they're still being used. Well, where was eHealth? Well, I thought we were supposed to have eHealth. I know the country of Belize got its healthcare technology from Canada, for example, at a very reasonable price, I might add. And they have a more advanced eHealth system than Canada does, which is just crazy. And the costs of some of these things, the cost of the inefficiency and the waste, we just can't afford it anymore.
Okay,
We
so
never really
accountability.
could, but yeah,
Accountability.
accountability.
Okay, what else? What's the solution, sir?
So you mentioned the red tape. The red tape comes in many forms. But for example, we have, in terms of building science and the development of building codes, we've got new ideas that are coming forward. Some are good, some aren't good. But all of these new, where you require things to be in a certain way, they have to be tested properly in terms of cost benefit. If you're going to force a consumer to pay for something, there should be a benefit to it as well. And there's a lot happening in that part of the world that we're getting wrong. The 45 different government agencies and bodies that have their fingers in the approvals process. We've looked at more advanced jurisdictions, and they have about 12 to 16. And they're applying, building information modeling and GIS that we're not applying yet. We actually don't even have mandates for that. We've got people that talk about modular housing and how it's going to be a solution and everything else like that, and there's truth to that. But we don't really have mandates for that either, like targets, visions. And of course, modular housing is great and panelized housing is great. But in order to build the factories, you need a market. And so you need thousands of units to be ordered. And it's actually quite perfect for students housing, transitional housing, seniors housing, producing that kind of product. But again, no mandate, no drive to it, and what have you. And then we get municipalities going off and declaring their own climate change emergencies and coming up with their own way to address the climate. Well, that's crazy. We need one system right across the province, like we have one building code. In fact, we pointed out that a lot of these various municipal green measures are actually contrary to the Ontario Building Code, but nobody's enforcing it. And it's very confusing for builders, and it adds to cost at, precisely the wrong time.
Okay,
Yeah,
having better numbers and targets,
yeah.
accountability, reducing red tape and regulation. What else?
And then infrastructure for the future. This is huge. We need a new funding formula, aligning the three levels of government, how we are in terms of the investment, where the money's going to come from for infrastructure. DCs, development charges, have become a cancerous abomination. They're, as I said, they're a direct
cancerous
tax.
abomination.
Yeah. No, they are, because they're a direct tax. They're a direct tax on the new home buyer and renter. They're inequitable. They're not income tested. It's a regressive tax. It's not growth pays for growth. That's all baloney, right? But the money that's collected, a lot of it's sitting in these reserve funds, not being used for the purpose intended. But municipalities don't want to let it go either, because they do need money. Now, I've talked to mayors and stuff like that, but it's just the wrong way of going about doing it, because what we've done is we have like a down payment today, Brian, a down payment today for your average young family in Ontario is a combination of an increase in development charges and the HST on new housing in the last 15 years. And that's a down payment. So if you're talking about 200,000 on $1 million home, right? So we're talking about $200,000, roughly. Okay, that's 100% of a down payment. People come along and say, "Well, the taxes, that's only 20% of the overall price of the home." Yeah, but it's the down payment. It's not just 20% of something. So, we're getting it all terribly wrong, and we're not. And this is another problem we're going to have going forward, is for some of because we need new sewer and water. We need look at what. Here's a big one for you. Another conversation. The electrification of everything. Our grid can't handle it, and there's no discussion about how the 10 billion that Toronto Hydro needs, or the 30 billion that the provincial hydro group needs to upgrade the grid to handle electrification.
Okay, so we're gonna have to we could go on for another day.
We could go on all day.
We've been talking about better data and better targets. We've been talking
Yeah.
about red tape and regulation. We've been talking about taxes and reducing taxation, particularly on new homes. We've been talking about a better funding formula for infrastructure. But you said, and a lot of those are operational, but you said what we need is a new vision. So if you were the Premier of Ontario, the Prime Minister of Canada, what would be your vision, sir?
Amongst other things, I think the first thing is we need to put ourselves where we're in the top 5, top 10 in the world on any given category. Currently, we're not. Like, we're, by the OECD measures, we are second last in getting things approved and done, basically, right? You look at some of the World Bank measures on Canada, they're terrible. So there are metrics out there that we can measure our performance again and that against, and that's what we need to do. We need to start doing that. You know, the city of Tokyo has a program with the World Bank where they assist countries to refine their infrastructure planning and spending and urban planning and stuff like that. We don't have that. They're not coming to Toronto, right, Brian? No one's coming here to find out how we're doing things right. And do you remember once when the Red Rocket was the #1 transit system in North America?
Not anymore.
We were it. Yeah, no, that's been gone. In fact, that story went 10 years past its due date. You know, so you believe your own baloney, and that's always a danger. And we do, and we've got this thing where people sort of say it's almost like if politicians say it's going to happen, then it's going to happen. Not anymore, right? Because we're taxed too much. We're taxing things at a level that people can't afford. When you think about that construction worker we talked about, that after 3-4 years of getting to Canada could buy a home, that's not happening. So we've lost our way there. So that vision needs to be one of, how is the average person supposed to live? What does that world look like? What are the services going to be look like? And set some bars there. And then as you break all this stuff down into sort of manageable slots, the whole has to be like, for example, at housing, one of the problems with housing, nobody was looking at housing from the 30,000-foot level. We had these 45 different government groups all running around doing their own thing and often tripping each other up. And still today, we see that where the government makes a change over here, which is beneficial to new housing. But then something else is introduced over here. Development charges, for example, in Toronto going up this past spring 21% when we can't sell a condo, right? A new condo in Toronto.
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Richard Lyall,
So we can do it.
thank you so much. We got to check in again and see what you think about what these premiers, mayors, prime ministers, leaders of different political parties have as their visions as they set them out over the course of the next couple of months, and see if we can do a better job. I really appreciate your input. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. And all my podcasts and videos are put up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media, LinkedIn, YouTube, and podcast servers as soon as the radio show goes to air. You know what? I think we do need a vision. I think that purpose and passion are critical in life, critical in government, critical in companies, and critical in our community. And I think we've lost it right now. And I think we need it. And I think Richard's given us a good agenda. Thank you. Good night, everybody.